Hi everyone, I'm Paul Vetch, I'm Strategy Director at Torchbox. I have to apologise for the whole kind of green on green thing that's going on here. I'm not going to disappear and become a floating head in front of some exotic backdrop. It's just a clothing error. I'd just like to first of all thank everyone for joining us today for what I hope, I'm sure, will be probably occasionally a bit of a frightening conversation, but hopefully more than that, overwhelmingly a reassuring one and a thought-provoking one. So we're here today to discuss proliferation of websites, or to put it another way, the tendency that university web estates have to grow out of control in an unmanageable way. Proliferation is a pretty gnarly word to say. I'm almost certain to stumble over it at least once today. But it's also a word that we've come to associate with weapons of mass destruction, rather unfortunately, rather than websites. But if you're responsible for digital at a university, then you may well feel that being accountable for a sprawling digital estate, which grows exponentially, whether you like it or not, is nearly as dangerous. Now, this isn't a problem that's limited to higher education, obviously, as evidenced by the fact, for example, that we have lots of colleagues from YouGov joining us today. But higher education is probably where the scale of the challenge is biggest, not least because universities embrace the flexibility of publication via the web from day one. And it's a challenge that became very apparent to me in my previous role in digital R&D at one of the UK's top 10 universities. I don't know, maybe 13, 14, 15 years ago. Now well, 15 years ago for 10 years or something along those lines. Now my team alone was responsible for adding something like 40 to 50 websites to the university's digital estate each year. And we were just one department. And each of those websites came with an inbuilt expectation that they'd remain online basically until the end of time. They, of course, came with no budget for support or hosting or anything like that. And so for my sins, I ended up being asked to help the university's central infrastructure team look at options to tackle this challenge across the university. And once I'd looked under that particular rock, I really wished I hadn't. There were literally thousands of insecure legacy websites managed by hundreds of different agencies and third parties with little or no governance and a completely reactive approach to dealing with, the inevitable problems like sites being hacked or defaced. Equally though, it was often really hard to argue with the need for most of those sites to exist. And it definitely wouldn't have been practical for an already stretched central IT department to take on responsibility for managing them all. So since then, I moved to Torchbox, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to work with lots of other universities, including both Oxford and the University of Pennsylvania, who I think are represented on the call here today. And my general feeling, though, is that the problem is still acute and endemic, not always acknowledged, and nor really are the potential implications well understood. The fact ultimately is that most universities just don't know how many websites they're responsible for. So on that, as I said before, slightly frightening note, I'm really pleased today to be able to introduce our excellent panel of speakers who are going to walk us through understanding the scale of the problem, some processes for coping and tackling site proliferation. See, I told you I'd stumble over it at least once, and a specific technical approach that's successfully addressing the challenge for one institution. So we have today with us Chris Malek and Cynthia Kiser, who are joining us from the California Institute of Technology, better known to all of us, I'm sure, as Caltech. And by my calculations, Chris and Cynthia have about 43 years collective experience between them at Caltech, so they probably know it reasonably well by now. Chris is Associate Director of Academic Development, and he leads the service team there, which develops the bulk of Caltech's enterprise web apps and websites. And Cynthia is a Senior Application Developer, and she's been directly involved in developing the solution that they're going to talk about with us today. Mike Pearson left the cut and thrust of agency life to become head of digital at the London School of Economics and Political Science, again better known to you and me as the LSE. And as you'd expect, Mike's team is responsible for the main public-facing website, amongst other things, but Mike himself also has responsibility for LSE's digital strategy, content governance, and publishing model. And first up today is Paul Bradley, who is co-founder of eQAfy, a company which has developed a range of tools to audit, quality assure, and monitor higher education digital ecosystems. helping to improve digital performance and manage risk. And his tools sort of span, and they work across websites and social media. I first became aware of eQAfy through their annual surveys, which offer really valuable insights into technology trends across higher education in both North America and the EU. So, for example, they regularly publish data that shows the most popular CMS platforms across the top 100 universities and so on. I really recommend those. Paul's going to kick things off today by walking us through some of his data to illustrate the potential scale of the site proliferation problem. Over to you, Paul.
Right, thank you very much. Let's screen share. Hopefully you'll get to see some slides in a moment. Let me know if you can't. Slides? Good. Okay. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Paul Bradley. Thank you for joining the webinar today, and thank you, Paul, for the introduction. My part of the webinar is going to be divided into two. We're going to develop a working definition of website proliferation by understanding how it actually occurs, and then we'll examine why website proliferation is actually an issue for universities and colleges in particular. But before we get into any of that, let's start with a story. And we're going to go back to 2019. And in July 2019, I found myself sitting at the back of a lecture theatre at the University of Greenwich in London. Now, remember that name, University of Greenwich, because it's going to come up again a little bit later on. And I was attending something called the IWMW, the Institutional Web Management Workshop. It's the annual conference for UK university web teams. And it was a room packed with experienced professionals charged with managing the websites of some of the UK's most prestigious universities. And Jonathan Trout stepped up. He'd just been appointed as head of web at the University of Edinburgh. And he started his presentation with a request. He said, "Put your hand up if you know how many websites your university owns." Now, from my seat at the back, I scanned the crowd in front of me, and Jonathan waited for the audience to respond. Nothing. Not a hand went up, not a single one. Can you imagine any other set of university assets where the staff maintaining them couldn't tell anyone how many they owned? Hang on a sec. Okay, we have a technical failure here. 1 second. Okay, good. Let's see why the audience couldn't comply with Jonathan's request. And the answer lies in the World Wide Web's academic research origins. So once the academic community had understood the power of the World Wide Web, universities rapidly started publishing digital content. And on the slide, I've picked 3 examples from actually 1992, 1993. And in fact, the one on the left, the CNRS page, is actually still online. So that group of enthusiasts and early adopters built the first sites, and as everybody else understood the impact, they jumped on board. And this established 2 important traditions. First, no central oversight. Now, I use the word oversight, not control, and that has led to what could be considered a robust culture of independent and autonomous digital content publishing. And the second thing is agile development. Not perhaps in the current formal definition, but definitely a cycle of publish, test the reaction, learn, repeat. And it's the nature of content experiments that they get abandoned. Staff move, needs change. There was simply no plan in the first place. There are no resources to maintain the presence. The legacy is large web estates with hundreds or thousands of sites, many with content that hasn't been updated in years. Now, I asked if universities could have any other collection of assets that they didn't know how many they owned. I think it's safe to say that common sense probably applies to the answer to that question. But simply knowing how many websites are in your digital estate is a valuable piece of information, as is knowing who owns or maintains the content on each of those sites. And the reason they're valuable is because the answers to both those questions reduce uncertainty. And when you reduce uncertainty, it allows you to make better decisions about individual websites themselves and about web estates as a whole. But actually obtaining that information is very time consuming and can prove to be very difficult. Ask anyone who has combed through an institution's DNS records in search of websites. It's not done terribly easily. And this may all seem like a purely administrative issue, but it isn't. Why not? Well, because digital at universities has evolved from being content publishing experiments in the 1990s and 2000s to being the primary way in which institutions now tell their stories to recruit students, to raise funds, to promote research activities, and equally, it's the primary way in which their audiences, plural, now find information or complete tasks. And the sheer scale and scope of digital estates has a number of readily observed negative impacts. So visitors may find that their way across web estates, as they make their way across web estates, they encounter uneven content. The navigation itself can be unnecessarily confusing, and much of the content can prove to be inaccessible. I'm sure you're all well aware of the large number of PDFs scattered across most higher education web estates. And on individual sites, content can be off-brand. You get mutations of logos in idiosyncratic color schemes and the like. And the content can even be off-message because it's not being updated readily. And you take all of those, and there's a separate set of concerns that lack of awareness can mean that things like compliance, user privacy, security issues can all be masked. And all of that gets in the way of institutions telling their stories and ensuring that visitors get the best possible user experience. Now, how bad can this be? Well, the slide shows some histograms, and it's the number of pages across a selection of UK and US university websites. So that top and bottom left are UK universities, top and bottom right are US four-year institutions. So the top two charts are histograms showing page counts. And probably the most pertinent thing to focus on is on the one on the left is that a typical UK institution has around 100,000 pages scattered across its web estate. Jump to their US counterparts and that number goes up to around 500,000. That's right, 500,000 pages of web content spread across a web estate. And if you go to the two charts at the bottom, the most egregious examples in the US, Penn State, about 8.5 million pages, and even the University of Cambridge in the UK has close to 2 million pages scattered across its web estate. And that content bloat leads to complexity and potentially even higher cost. Now, to illustrate complexity, I've reproduced the kind of basic network diagram we plot at the end of one hour of our web estate scans. And in this particular case, it's the first 1,000 websites. Yes, that's right, the first 1,000 websites at the University of Toronto. So that's utoronto.ca. At the center is the main institutional URL. That's the purple node. The orange represents different subdomains. So at the University of Toronto, for example, you get things like studentlife.utoronto.ca or biology.utoronto.ca. And the green nodes are individual websites. And there's two things to really take away from looking at that diagram. You'll notice a number of nodes around the edge that aren't joined to the main network. We call these rogue sites. These are websites where the content owner has decided to use something other than the main university naming convention. There's one down at the bottom there called utovs.com, which is actually connected to the ophthalmology department. And that is very hard to find when it's disconnected from the rest of the network. The second thing to notice is a little bit harder here, but if you look at one of these diagrams online, some of those green nodes are 6 or 7 hops away from the main university landing page, which may well indicate that there's a very lengthy user journey to get from the main landing page to valuable content at the end. And I'll just note in passing that to date, the largest estate we've encountered has more than 15,000 websites. So, the primary digital estate objectives are telling your institution's story and meeting the needs of those prospective students, undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate, addressing past students. They reach out to faculty and staff, the media, researchers, and countless others. And it's difficult to assess or even know how effective your digital estate is when you don't have accurate or timely information about its composition. And that lack of information actually increases uncertainty or risk. And you recall earlier I said to hold on to the name University of Greenwich. Well, in 2016, the University of Greenwich didn't have a complete record of all of its websites. And hackers took advantage and used a SQL injection attack on a website form, a form on a site that had been set up in 2004 for a conference and subsequently abandoned. And they used that to gain access to a server. And from there, they extracted and published sensitive personal data on about 3,500 individuals. A subsequent investigation by the UK's Information Commissioner resulted in the university being fined about £120,000, that's about $155,000 US. The takeaway, website proliferation is a problem. It has real consequences for institutions and their audiences, but those issues can be managed when you have accurate and comprehensive data. So now, why don't we hear about two approaches to managing those large connections of websites?
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm going to just follow up very briefly with a quick question for you, which,
yes.
I mean, obviously, one of the things that's particularly frightening about them, and you've given us a really interesting, and as I said earlier, frightening sense of the scale of the issue. But, I mean, obviously, the more time passes, the bigger a problem this becomes. I just wondered if, from your data, you've seen any evidence of schools or universities who've been making a concerted effort, and maybe a successful concerted effort to to tackle the problem.
Right, okay. So you're right in one sense, proliferation is a problem, but actually I think it's a symptom of other underlying issues, and that's really how it manifests itself. I would suggest there are a number of institutions making progress on this at the moment. It's being driven by accessibility, whether that's in the UK or in the States. The need to understand the resources you might need to allocate to accessibility projects means that you do need to know how many websites you might need to address. And for some institutions, that is driving at least a good look at how big their web estate is. And from there, they can then figure out how much resource they need to allocate to accessibility. I would suggest that for a lot of other institutions, and I'm sure Mike and Cynthia and Chris can get into this more detail, the focus for the last little while has been getting courses online over many other concerns. So perhaps when that dies down a bit, people will return to the proliferation issue.
Yeah, cool. That makes sense. Well, what we'll do then is, I guess, transition directly to Mike Pearson. So Mike, I met for the first time in a pitch, and it was a pitch for not a university level website, not a departmental level website, but a research unit website. And I remember thinking at the time that it was pretty unusual for a university's head of digital to be involved in a procurement process for, you know, yet another standalone site. It kind of felt a bit masochistic, as though in sanctioning the existence of yet another standalone website, Mike was just making his job even more difficult. I think, in fact, I asked Mike about it during the pitch, and that is possibly one of the reasons why we didn't win. But Mike's, in follow-up conversations, I came to understand that Mike's adopted a really pragmatic, and I think I'll even go so far as to say enlightened approach to site proliferation at LSE that's much more focused on, I think I'm quoting you here, Mike, persuasion rather than mandation.
Yeah.
And he's going to talk us through that a bit now.
Yeah, well, it was fun to sit on the opposite side of the table from an agency pitching, because I'd done that for the last 20 years, because I'm a relatively recent entrant to HE. I only joined the LSE in October 2018, having spent most of my working life in the private sector working for agencies. And one of the first things I tried to do is understand the scale of what we were dealing with in terms of website estate and properties, something I'm still doing, because we have a huge number of individual properties, and there are lots of separate and distinct properties, but there are very different scales, and that does create some significant challenges around management, especially with relatively recent legislative changes like the ICO cookie directive in the UK, and as Paul has mentioned before, what are known as the rolls off the tongue, the 2018 Public Sector Website and Mobile Applications Accessibility Guide regulations. But those two things are really sort of actually quite important, because they do give levers for how you're going to assess your estate, because there's legal compliance you need to run with. The approach I decided to take at LSE, because I've got limited resources and time, and I could exhaust myself just by spreading myself too thinly, is actually to allow some controlled proliferation in the short to medium term. So while looking for consolidation in the long term, and I don't believe that proliferation of a sort is necessarily fundamentally a problem if it's handled well. But that is an extremely big if, because you have to have the policies and processes in place to sort of keep people moving in the same direction. And that's why I was in the pitch, because it's like, I can't provide right now with my central services what you need. So if you're going to go externally, let's make sure you're going externally with the sort of partners that can provide the service we want in the way that we desire and in a sort of sensible way. Torchbox can do that. They just didn't get this one. So like many HE institutions, because there is a framework in place for operational matters, but there is significant freedom within that. So I don't have anything like a command and control mandate that you might get in a private sector sort of environment where it's like, you do this or I fire you. It's like absolutely no way that's going to work in an HE institution. So I have to pick the problems I want to tackle very carefully to get the best balance of outcomes with the limited resources I've got. And the thing is, with this freedom, any central solution is in effect in competition with other alternatives. So what I've got to ponder is, how do I make my central solution that would help control proliferation the most attractive option? And why is it that people look elsewhere? So understanding that tension and those problems and why a central solution might not be quite right is really important to get your head around why things proliferating. So instead of wasting all that energy sort of forcing people down a path that's not necessarily right for them and they want to do, it's engaging with them to offer advice, understand their needs, use that to feed back into the central platform, and also make sure what they're doing, they get a solution that works for them pragmatically, but it's like not going to be a million miles away from where we want to go in the long term. And I'm using that information, if you like, to improve the central services in parallel so that they do become more competitive. So I'm balancing resources against impact and risk and looking for the best overall outcomes. And if we're going in broadly the same direction, I think we're going to get ourselves to a good place. But it is my genuine belief that centralization can offer much better cost efficiency, security, and operational sophistication. But it has to be flexible and responsive too. It has to meet user needs. The users in this case are the people who are actually producing the properties. And often a fair criticism of central systems is that they are slow, unwieldy, inflexible, difficult to extend. All these sort of things cause problems. So it's like tackling that with what you do. But to kind of make that persuasive argument, you really do have to have an understanding of current usage, internal structures, and politics. I mean, there are so many different sort of sources of power and control within an HE that understanding people's needs individually and what they can do and how you're going to work with them is really important. At my interview, I said to the director who employed me that mostly software problems that we're dealing with are actually people problems. It's like understanding the people is the key to getting the software and the underlying systems and services right. But if I can get people on board, then I think they can understand the benefit of constraining and managing the estate and making future developments better aligned with this long-term strategy. But you've got to do it through building relationships. So the way I've decided to do that is try to be in the room with potential developments and discuss this sort of pragmatic, help discuss these things, consultative, using sort of the experience I took in from the agency world, which is really understanding the problem at hand. The thing about LSE, and I think it's the same about institutions where people are there for a long time, is that if you're doing good stuff, work tends to get around, and also that means you get invited to participate more. But against that, if you're talking about a different way of doing things, people are often scared of going first. They don't want to be the ones to try something new and potentially run the risk of that. So I found it's easier to to persuade with concrete examples. So Google's approach of dog feeding, eat your own dog food, that we created this year for our new cohort of students a welcome website. We did it specifically because of the challenges of onboarding students in an environment where they may be all over the place this year. They might not be able to get to campus for a while, but we did it with our central CMS, but we did it in a radically different way to the way it had been done historically, because in the background, we've been upgrading the systems heavily. So we ran our CMS, which is Consensus, in a fully headless mode. So we used the content delivery API into a React front end, which is fast, it was cheap, and it was good. We delivered the whole site in less than 5 weeks with one developer, me doing the content typing and a team of editors. So now we've got an example to go. The main service doesn't have to be slow or cumbersome or unwieldy. And it's got really good feedback around the school, because it's a very important thing for us at this time. We have to get this right. So it's getting in front of the right people, and that gives us momentum to persuade more people that this is the right way to go. So I know some people say that it's not possible to be fast, cheap, and good, but it is if you're realistic about what you achieve and you've done your groundwork. It's all about giving people the tools they need to get their job done at hand. And I think just before I hand back to Paul, a couple of last points. I think the thing that I've really realized is working off an incredibly strong, clear underlying content model is core to making a site work. What you see is a lot of people proliferate entities within their website. So here's a person, here's a piece of news, here's an article. Those things, if defined well centrally and then being able to be delivered to different endpoints, can be done through a central system. So there's a balance of how it looks versus the way the data is controlled. And it's, I think, really focusing on your content model is something that's worth doing, because they need to be planned, and in lots of institutions they're grown organically. So just before I hand back to Paul, I think in conclusion, what we're trying to do is create an attractive and easy to use central platform that makes it a better proposition for our user groups than going independent, and with an understanding that you can't be dogmatic. And over time, I want to move towards a centrally based API driven approach that helps to control proliferation at LSE. Back to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Mike. Again, another super quick question. Obviously, my experience of you was that you were obviously providing direct support in person.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess since that point, I mean, are you moving towards developing guidelines or advice for procurement? Are you sort of setting standards and disseminating that stuff?
Yeah, there's a number of ways I think you can control it, and one of the good routes is like the murder mystery. It's like follow the money. So I talk to procurement, and now for new things, we have written non-functional requirements into web properties that mean that they are effectively captured by an approach that has to consider using the central CMS. So you need to be able to ingest content from an API, because that's what we're going to provide you with, those sorts of things, and making sure that they consult with us as well. We've also, and this is where things like Microsoft Teams, which is what we use, we're a 365 environment, is really useful, because setting up communities of practice to discuss this are really good. We've got 250 people in our digital community of practice at LSE, and it's quite, there's a reasonable amount of conversation in there, and people are starting to help each other. So I think the community aspect of it is important, because people know it's a mindset thing, this, as much as it is like a compliance or a regulatory thing.
Yeah, I guess one of the most frustrating things about site proliferation is the sort of fundamental inefficiency of it all, because you know for a fact that there's so much wheel reinvention going on in terms of publishing the same content, news and events. And you see that going on, but it's difficult to sort of get everyone to sort of catalyze an organization level, everyone's attention into solving that as a problem.
So we've got lots of restaurants, and it's like everyone's decided to grow their own potatoes. Just buy them and do something interesting with them instead. It's I think that is it. It's like if you have a strong trunk that people can look at and go, actually, I could just get that core stuff for free. Effectively, I can use my budget on doing something that's differentiating and more relevant for my audiences, and more generally just more exciting and more relevant. I think minimizing your cost and what you're spending on, if you like, the bread and butter components of what you deliver is really important. For
sure. And on that note, I guess it is time to move to Chris and Cynthia, who came across Torchbox's radar because Caltech was an early adopter of the Wagtail CMS. And for any of the people on the call who joined an early point, you might have heard us talking about it a little bit. If you've not heard of Wagtail, Wagtail's a Python Django-based open source content management system, originally built by us for the Royal College of Arts in 2014. But since then, it's taken off in a big way and become much more of a system in its own right. So in the US, you'll find Wagtail at MIT, at Princeton, at UPenn, at UChicago. In the UK, if you've looked at the nhs.uk website for COVID advice in the last 6 months, then you've experienced Wagtail. Now, the Wagtail link just simply means that we've kept in quite close touch with Caltech for the last few years. We've not really had much to do with the work they've done there, but obviously we've been interested in it. And today we're going to hear about how they've created a digital platform that's helping them to grapple with their own site proliferation challenges. For the second time, I've messed up that word.
A hard word. So, hi, my name is Chris Malek, and with me is Cynthia Kiser. She is one of my employees. I am the Associate Director of Academic Development, as Paul introduced me. This is my 25th year at Caltech, so I've been here a while, and I've seen the web almost from its inception at Caltech. So we are a prominent university where our peers are, Oxford and Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and yet we're small. I mean, small compared to those peers. We have about 7,000 people, so this is about as big as one of the schools at another university. And with our small size comes, unfortunately, a small IT budget. So my goal here is I'm going to give the background, and Cynthia is going to talk about our solution. So we don't have web governance at Caltech. We've always been a very decentralized campus. Also, because of our budgetary constraints, we don't have centralized web design or web content teams, but people do need websites. So they make them however they can. Departments need to advertise their services internally and share their policies and procedures, and our schools need to attract students and faculty really want to advertise their research so they can attract good grad students and funding especially. So in the past and ongoing, it's really, you have 4 states of websites. Either people run their own website, and sometimes this means that they're running it on a commodity piece of hardware under their desk. Or they use a hosting service like Wix or Squarespace or WordPress or something like that. Or they might use our old hosting service, my team's old hosting service that Cynthia also wrote. Or they just don't have a website because they don't have the skills or the money to run one. And so a few years ago, I think about this but I think about this a lot, and I realized that this is a real problem. It's a have versus have-nots problem. So, and why is it a problem? These websites are not secure. They're not reliable often, especially given the tickets that we get about please help me resuscitate my under the desk website for the HR department kind of thing. They're not branded properly. They are not accessible. These are all problems that that I see as I'm looking at Caltech. Now let's understand that I am not a governance, I'm not web governance, I'm a software development shop. So my philosophy at Caltech has always been to make Caltech a better place through the technology that my team can provide. And I do that not by doing things for them, but by giving people the capability to solve their own problems. And I looked around, so we're really the only web development shop at Caltech. So if anyone was going to solve this problem centrally, it was going to be us. We in the past, we have tried the, let's get people to stop proliferating so many websites and get them to collaborate on fewer websites, but it's very hard to get people to play nice together. And people, frankly, have a lot of, this is my website and you can have your own website over there. So I wanted to make something that was cost effective, preferably free, that was secure, that looks professional, that gives people the idea that when you come to a Caltech website, we know what we're doing. And it has to be easy enough to manage that my small team of 4 developers can take care of a lot of websites. So we chose to implement our own solution based on Wagtail, as Paul was saying. And we did it in a multi-tenanted way, if you know what that means. Cynthia will explain that in a little while. And we just set it up, and I've always used the Field of Dreams model. If you've ever seen that movie, if you build it, they will come. It's essentially, if you build it and you make it free, they will come. So now I'll hand over to Cynthia as to how we solve this problem.
Yes, so I was interested in Mike's presentation or discussion of entity modeling and sharing assets, sharing content. We've been doing that at Caltech almost since the start of the web in very specific pieces of content. We've had a centralized master calendar and a centralized newsfeed for a long time. But what we had before we started working with Wagtail was very inflexible sharing. So you had a very specific data model, and there were just a handful of ways you could use it. But it always came out looking like you cut and paste it from our central site. And as people have gotten more sophisticated at Caltech about what they want for a website, it's no longer okay to just say, all right, we've got something good enough, moving on. But we still have the issue that most people who manage websites at Caltech, that's a minority of what they do at Caltech. They're the content people, but they don't really have a lot of web skills, and they have no interest in getting specifically web skills, but they do have an interest in putting information out on the web in a sophisticated, modern looking, visually attractive way. So when we started building the new platform, we wanted something that gave people a lot more flexibility about what they built, but maintained the ease of use of our simpler site. So when we discovered Wagtail, they have an idea called a stream field, which is essentially a way of combining content units. And so what we have built in the last couple of years is a collection of UI components. Here's an image carousel, here's a block of links, here's a set of tabs, etc. And then we've put those into a system we call Caltech Sites. And that provides all of our content people with responsive elements that they can use, but they can combine them in a wide variety of ways. So our previous system, all the sites looked basically the same because you essentially had, here's your navigation, here's your side picture, here's your content. Now people can combine things in a much richer form. And they've been really very, very happy with that. The other thing that's different about the system that we built on top of Wagtail is that we're now using Wagtail's sites model. And so instead of having to spin up a new database and a new web server for each website, we use a multi-tenancy model, and we can add a new site through the web interface. Sometimes Chris will do that while he's in a meeting with someone. Here's your new site, go for it. And that can be really, really appealing. But it's also appealing specifically for us because with that lightweight combined hosting, it means that we don't have to charge everyone for, here's your web property, you're going to start getting a monthly bill. We can have conversations about, does it make sense for you to have a separate website? If so, what do you need? What kind of support do you need? And people can just run with it. The other thing that's been a plus is, as we have offered this as a free service, we've gotten more and more adoption. And so we've started to get communities of practice. We have entire organizations who have moved their websites to the same Caltech Sites platform. And so now they can help each other. And I think it's been really gratifying for me as I've helped people with their migrations, to see how people who haven't really had previously viewed, I have to deal with the website as a chore, get really excited about what they can do on the new Wagtail platform. So right now we have approximately 300 live sites. So if the goal were to stop site proliferation, we have failed. Only about half of those sites were migrated from somewhere else. The other 150 are new sites that have been added in the last 2 years. But from the standpoint of the Caltech community, I think our Wagtail initiative has been a really big success. The research groups and offices who are using it are now able to communicate with their respective audiences in a very direct way, and have been able to just have the technology sort of melt away and focus on the communication. And that's been really valuable for Caltech.
Thanks, guys. I was originally going to ask you what you felt your USP was, and how you've been able to sort of encourage adoption of the platform, but you've pretty much answered it by saying that you're offering a free service. How are you able to make it free?
It's partly because of our funding model, and partly because this is what the Institute has come to realize. I know if you look back 15 years ago, and you looked at what how internal IT costing models were moving, they were talking about chargeback. So we need to make IT costs transparent so that if we have an internal service that another department needs to use, they got to pay us for it. Well, that doesn't work because no one has any money. So what would happen is that I can't afford that, I can't afford that, I can't afford that. So if we wanted, so we realized about 3 or 4 years ago that if we really want to solve this problem, we have to make it affordable to everybody who needs a website. And that means that the Institute can eat some of the cost, which really is mostly people cost. The hosting costs are really quite insignificant compared to the people cost. We have these people here already, and we do a very valuable service for Caltech. So if we want to solve the problem of making Caltech have branded, secure, professional looking websites that for all the places that they need them, then we need to offer it for free. So, I mean, this was just a decision. Now, again, our scale, of course, helps us with this. So you look at our web properties, Paul is talking about millions and millions of pages. At other universities, we do not have millions of pages. We probably have 100,000 or fewer pages total at Caltech if I had to add up all of our web properties. And all of our important web properties, you can probably cover in 300 websites. So I think we have all of the division or all of the academic websites and all, aside from individual faculty members, and all of the administrative department websites in our system already. So it makes sense since this is go ahead, Cynthia.
Well, I was also going to say that I think we have made the case that if we consolidate to just build a single platform that serves www.caltech and individual professors' websites, we can focus on what do each of those need. And so again, there's the marginal hosting cost of spinning up a new website, but there's also somebody has a good idea, they request a feature, we build that, and then 300 sites have the opportunity to use it. And so I think we've managed to convince the people who pay Chris's and my salary that this is cost effective for the Institute.
Cool. Well, I'm keen that we give everyone everyone who's attending the opportunity to raise any questions they may have. So just encourage anyone to raise their hand at this point if they have anything they'd like to ask our panel. We have a hand from Rock Howard.
Yeah, I wonder if we could get some details on like the minimum version of Wagtail we should be looking at to get the multi-tenancy. Thank you.
So that's an interesting question. Do you want to talk about that, Cynthia? Okay, so that's interesting. We have a lot of our own modifications that really allows the multi-tenancy that we wanted. Because what I wanted was something like what you get when you go to Squarespace. You log into a Squarespace website and you don't realize that you're not the only site on the system. So Wagtail out of the box does not come with that, although we are working with the Wagtail core team, of which Cynthia is now on the Wagtail core team.
Yeah, so we're the next step is an RFC, but I think we're committed to moving our patches as soon as we can.
But Rock, if you are interested in multi-tenancy, we're happy to talk to you about what we did. It's technical, so I'm not going to talk about it right now. So to answer your question, we're getting ready to roll out Wagtail 2.10, which is the latest version.
Yeah, I mean, Wagtail itself has supported multi-tenancy since I think 1.8. But as Chris says, the work that they've done there is quite specific to their local situation, and they've done quite a lot of custom work on it. If I'm not seeing any more hands at the minute, so I think what I might do is ask a question to Mike, which picks up on one of the conversations we had after that famous pitch of which we've spoken.
Paul, we have got some questions actually in the Q&A.
Oh, go for it.
So we've got, what do you do when a department's specific needs go beyond pure content management? Do you do it inside Wagtail, for example, an admissions application? I assume that's to Caltech.
You want to go, Cynthia?
Yeah, I would say for things that are more than that, we tend to do it elsewhere. So with a very specific application like that, we would use we would probably make a standalone website. Although we can leverage, because again, we are the central web team, we can take our theme app and put it onto another Django site.
Yeah,
in fact,
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say, I've always wanted to keep the focus of our content management system purely on websites. So if there is another bit of functionality that they want, we make it as an external application, and then either I frame it or integrate it.
So the question,
we do actually have one or two. If it's not a whole application, there's just one little thing that not everybody else uses. The other thing that we've added to Wagtail is a features, basically a feature flag manager. And so we have a couple of instances where we'll add a feature and then turn it on for one site.
Yeah.
So that's our intermediate. If it's a whole other web app, it's outside the content management system. If it's a tiny tweak, we'll feature flag it and put it inside.
So the question I had for Mike was a related one, which is picking up on something that came up when we were talking before. I remember, and it has to do with this issue of kind of sites that don't fit the mold, I guess. Mike, you've spoken to me before about the different strategies that research groups or departments try to offer to put to you to try and retain their freedom and do whatever they want.
Yeah.
And you've spoken in terms of the poisoned pill specification, which I think is a really wonderful concept. And I just wondered if you could sort of give us a run through of that and talk about how you've dealt with it.
Okay, yeah. So it's a term that I picked up years ago reading a book about, of all things, mergers and acquisitions. It's like a defensive strategy that can be used by a company. Is it if it's a hostile takeover, is they buy something that their aggressor doesn't want. It's basically a poison pill. They swallow something that's going to make them a less attractive target and just make the whole thing much more awkward. But what I realized was I was seeing some, and there were, we'll name anonymous to protect the guilty, some specifications coming through where people had like specifically written specifications around functions they demanded that they needed, that they knew the central systems couldn't support. They're like, particular features, particular ways of doing things. And it's like, well, that's our justification for not coming in centrally. And that's a really interesting one, because for me, the tactic with that is like, well, why? What are you trying to achieve with that piece of functionality? And to go right, always go right back to the audience needs and what requirement are you fulfilling with this? Because often they're written as like technical pieces or technology-led pieces rather than service or experience-led pieces. So the strategy for that is basically just to zoom right out and go, are you sure? And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But it's good. Actually, sometimes those conversations are very good because they do make people refocus on actually what are you trying to achieve? And especially because we're in a similar situation, I think, to Caltech, in that our central service is free. I mean, it's centrally funded by the school. So if someone wants to work within the main platform, if they're using existing templates, they don't have to pay anything. And then if you can say to them, well, actually, instead of going off and doing the basic stuff in a different way because you want a different technology for reasons that we don't have to go into, work with us, get most of what you want for nothing, in effect, to your budgets, and then use the money that you were going to spend on the basic things to spend on something that's going to make you really stand out or save some of it and spend it on something else, or hold it back till you really learn what your users want when you put stuff in contact with them. So it's a dialogue-based solution really, but it's spotting when people are trying to pull the wool over your eyes by something that is clearly like, this is the hill that I'm prepared to die on from a technology point of view, and just saying, come down, come and work with me.
Yeah, I feel your pain. I mean, I know I've certainly heard every argument under the sun as to why an individual academic needs a Cray supercomputer running a puce flashing website, because it's absolutely critical to their career and the reputation of the university before now.
Yeah, that never happens at Caltech.
No, and I'm sure.
I'm sure it doesn't.
I'm sure. Scientists are by far the most reasonable when it comes to this kind of stuff. There's no question about that. Yeah, for sure.
Being constrained, definitely.
So, Paul,
can I ask? Well, I'd like to ask a question, because actually both Mike and Chris have brought this up, and I guess Cynthia is implied it. So in both cases, the central option is free. That's clearly a necessary condition. Is it sufficient to get everybody in, or are there other things that you also have to do to get them to jump on board?
It has to be good too. So yeah, if you can be cheap, good, and fast, the triumvirate, then that's a big win. So that was actually the problem with our old platform. It was a wonderful platform when Cynthia wrote it. When was it? 12 years ago?
Yeah, 12 years ago. It suited its needs, but it's time to go.
But it couldn't keep up with modern web development design, how people are designing websites now. And so people were not adopting it. So and that was not free, but it was cheap. So yeah, I would say it has to be free or very cheap, and also something that's attractive to them. They have to be able to solve their problems. If they can't, ultimately, it has to go hand in hand. I have to be able to afford it, and it has to solve my problem. If it doesn't solve my problem where I can afford it, go ahead.
And sometimes people just want to do their own thing. So one of the questions in the question and answer is, any idea how many people still go custom? We don't have an idea of the people who just start off custom because they won't have come through our door. But we've had probably 10 groups who have kind of come in, kicked the tires, and said, no, I really want to do my own thing. And that's fine. If they want to do their own, set up their own system, pay their own web designer, or at Caltech it's usually Dragoon, their graduate student, then so be it. But we at least have an offering that is attractive to the majority.
So we've got another interesting question here around kind of content and governance, which is, how much is everyone giving users direct access to update content on their websites? We've had issues in the past with content going rogue, fancy that, and not meeting standards. And I've actually seen big benefits from cutting the access people have and getting them to submit changes in a ticketed manner.
I've got a perspective on that. LSE, I think we have somewhere in the region of an active editor website based on Essential website of probably 300 people. So it's quite a big community. But that ranges from the graduate researcher who has been given this job because they were the last person to step backwards, right through to the other end, full-time professional content marketers, because they're in a very much content-driven area. So we do have some issues with variability in quality, and it's definitely something that we want to work on. I think long term, you probably do get a much better result by having fewer people who are more skilled. But there's always a tension between, well, how fast can you do it? And I want it now, and I want it done under my control. So there's the dialogue between, well, we're full-time professionals at this. We can understand what you need. We can give you something that's going to work for your audiences versus I just want it done. So there's a quite big educational piece around that, as well as just like a fundamental control piece from a policy point of view. because the danger is you go, right, we can offer this service, but people are like, yeah, well, it's still not fast enough for me. And then they run off and proliferate, because not only do they not want to work with you within your main platform because it's too slow, they just build their own website. So it's actually quite a dangerous, it's quite a tricky conversation to have, to make sure that you've got a trustworthy, high quality service that people can rely on. I think that's a lot of what it comes down to.
I mean, this feels like a fundamental problem that lies at the heart of site proliferation, in that you've got this sort of tension between centralized Marcom's function that obviously has a specific job to do and want to try and set out clear guidance around excellence in terms of what external communications look like. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got individual academics who want to exercise their rights to communicate and publish with complete freedom. And somehow this is the sort of problem domain that heads of digital, that people in your position, Mike and Chris, are sort of tasked with trying to manage. And there's a sort of fundamental tension there, isn't there?
Mm. I think there is, and I don't think it's limited to from our sector, because I work with someone who ran the digital properties for a large museum, and some of the experiential stuff, and they had the same thing where researchers are like, please let me give you 2,500 words on why this particular piece of Egyptian pottery is really important. And they're like, but there's hundreds of these things in the cabinet. The audience needs to get around them, and that thing of like explaining what you're interested in may not be articulated in the same way for an audience is a very tricky thing to have, because it's, if you get it wrong, you can really offend someone, because it's kind of impinging on their how they feel about themselves. So it's it's another thing where it's like you have to be quite sensitive, and it's very much a person-to-person thing rather than a technology or process thing. I think that otherwise you can have a lot of upset.
Can I ask another question at that point then? So Mike, in your situation, if you go higher up your organization, to what degree do you think they understand the pivotal nature of the role that you're in now, which is sort of a bit of a safeguard between poor quality content getting out there, but at the same time understand that you've got, I don't know, cats to herd, and that's a tricky job?
I think there's definitely a growing understanding, because there's been like a huge boost in it because of the very unfortunate circumstances we all find ourselves in, because then now it's like, I can't bring everyone here into the same room. What am I going to do? Right. And like, how do I ensure that they get the experience that they've paid for, the quality that we can deliver? So, but I think there's a general trend to realizing that actually, that much as some people might resist it, that you have to present yourself. I mean, I may say this because of my background, but there's definitely an element of like marketing, communication, selling stuff within your communication, and really being audience focused. And I think there's definitely a growing feeling that quality of experience is really important, and that's not just digital. That's everything about being a student or an academic or a member of staff at university. You know, these institutions need to feel good to interact with.
Yep. On which note, I'm afraid everyone, I'm sorry to say we've hit time. So unfortunately, we'll need to wrap up. So firstly, I'd like to offer my thanks to Paul, Mike, Chris and Cynthia for generously sharing their time and insights with us today. We will endeavour to follow up with everyone who's attended with answers to questions that we didn't get to. There were a few Wagtail specific ones that we parked, which we can follow up on. So no problem there. We'll also be asking everyone for a bit of feedback, very brief feedback on how you found the event today, so that we can make the next one better, or should I say even better?
Just say better, not gonna be offended.
I know, yeah. It's all good. And finally, I'll just wish everyone a good day or a good evening, depending on your time zone.